对，就这个要，这
所以
是要。
哦，所以它是有点强的，比起褪黑素来
因
说。
为那个通灵是我们身体会分泌的东西。
这双是那个最后一双是同
在吃，
同学里面最后一双，
可能要吃少。
那正好36
偶尔会吃。
右脚比较小。
这个是有。
因为有2个同学给我推荐了之后，我就觉得。
All right, so we're gonna do some coding. Follow along if you want to do so. I'd highly recommend it. You don't have to, of course, but this way, if you run into any issues with any of this stuff, you can interrupt me and ask. So this is, basically for the rest of class, we're doing kind of a workshop thing. So it's kind of, working, but also, explaining as we go. Okay, so previously, whenever we've created a program for our class, we have done so using the, and actually I'm going to switch from my computer glasses to my regular ones so that when I look out, you are not all blurry. And my eyes will deal with the strain for 1 hour. It's not a big deal. Typically, you would create things as Swift Package Manager, libraries and executables, using the command line. That's kind of been the sort of go-to for assignments thus far. Moving forward, that is not how you will be creating your assignments. Moving forward, you will be building them as apps within Xcode that you could run on your phone if you are set up to do so. You will still be using Swift Package Manager for managing and using packages. I will tell you right now that the assignment for this coming assignment calls for you to use the package that the library package that the previous assignment asked you to make. So the previous assignment said, hey, make an executable that uses this library and build this as a library. This assignment uses that library as well, but rather than having a command line tool for interacting with the Let's Count API, you will use a user interface on an iPhone app. So to start with, we'll go ahead and click Create New Project, and we get this lovely interaction here. Because we're trying to make an iOS app, we should make sure to click off of multi-platform to iOS. That's not strictly required, but if you want to make sure you're just doing iOS, then that's a good choice. You can always add other platforms later. This just gets everything set up for you by default, ready to go. So you'll get this, you'll create your thing. We'll call this Class 7 Workshop, just because that's what we're doing. And in order to make sure that you're dealing with UIKit rather than Swift UI, in interface here, you'll need to select Storyboard. It defaults to Swift UI now. So if you want to do this in UIKit, you need to click Storyboard. Swift UI and UIKit, I won't say they don't play nice together, but they set the app up very differently initially. And then they can host each other if they want, but yeah. You don't need to set anything else. So yeah, organization identifier, whatever you want. I use com.neu.seattle. My username or whatever. You can do that if you want. You don't have to. You can do it however. And then we'll go ahead and create it here. And I'll make I don't need to make a new folder. In this case, it will make a folder for me. So there it is, Class 7 Workshop. And we get all this lovely stuff. So first thing you'll want to do when you're dealing with creating an app in this way, rather than from Swift Package Manager, is go to Build Settings. And you get to this screen, by the way, by clicking on this very top thing right here. Class 7 Workshop. This is your project, basically. You click on your project, and then over here, you click on your target, Class 7 Workshop target. Okay. By the way, how's the visibility? Are these readable for folks? Because I can zoom in more if needed. So
A little bigger, please.
a little bit? Okay. I can do that. Displays. That's what happened. Okay, how's this? Is this a little better? Perfect. All right. So, it's all in my way. So once you're here on your targets, in this top thing, you'll go to Build Settings. There's a bunch of Byzantine nonsense here, but near the bottom, you can see this Swift language version. If you want to be fancy, you can use the filter and type Swift, and then everything goes away except for what you want, right? Which is this. We are using Swift 6 in this class. Swift 6 gives us concurrency guidelines and static concurrency checking to make sure that we don't have data races. It is more of a pain because it gives you more compiler errors, but it's also much safer when you're handling concurrency, which we will constantly be doing because this is a networking focused class and you always do networking on the background. So switch this to Swift 6, it'll make your life a lot easier. Well, it might make your life harder initially, but it makes it easier in the long run. Okay, cool. So, I wish I had a way to keep my phone on. It's got all my notes, you know, for what I do, but it's not staying on. It's going to sleep. Which I mean, I appreciate that. It's saving its battery, but I just have to make sure I touch it every once in a while, I guess. Okay, so Swift version done. All right, so let's look at what nonsense is in here. You'll recall that when we make a Swift package manager package, there's basically two files, right? There's the package.swift file, which has our dependencies and stuff, and then there's the main.swift file, which actually like runs and executes our code. There is no main.swift file here. When you're dealing with a storyboard or UIKit application, then the application, the very first thing that kind of fires when your app starts is the app delegate, okay? And you can see this is kind of marked with this app main attribute to kind of give you that hint that this is where your app starts, okay? So these functions get called whenever these things happen for your app. So if your application finished launching, so your application, someone tapped on it and then it showed the launch screen, which is something separate, and we'll see how to set that shortly. It shows you the launch screen, and then it finishes loading and doing all the stuff in the background it needs to do, then this method gets called. So you can do stuff within this method in order to, get things kicked off and started, right? There's also lifecycle events for your application, such as configuration for connecting, whenever a new scene session is being created, or discarding the scene session whenever the user discards it, right? This is you don't need to mess with this. This is more complicated stuff, so we're not going to mess with it. Don't worry about it too much. Same thing with the scene delegate. All of these methods and everything used to all be in the app delegate together. They all used to be one thing in there. Apple split them up into two separate ideas, the app and the scene, as two different things, because they wanted to be able to have, on iPad, you'd be able to run different apps simultaneously on the screen at once and have them interact with each other. That's why they did this. That is so much more complicated than what we're going to be learning in this class. We don't have to mess with it. So know that you do need these, right? They exist, they're needed, but you're probably not going to mess with them too much, okay? There's this assets.xc assets. This is where you put any images that you want to use in your application. If you ever want to use an image, if you ever find an image online, like say, I don't know, this amazing GIF, okay? Unfortunately, it doesn't recognize GIFs, so you have to instead use exports of those GIFs, such as these, right? But let's go ahead and put them in. So you put them in here like so, okay? And now this this assets.xc asset can actually, it has these little slots and it shows you different things you can do, right? Here, basically, it wants to have, for Retina displays, it likes for every asset to have a 1x version, a 2x version, and a 3x version. They're supposed to be, that's pixel numbers, so seriously, guys, you should have, ideally, you'd put this at like 2x or something, and then you downscale it for a 1x and maybe upscale it to a 3x or something like that, right? But you don't have to worry about it for too much for the most part. So yeah, now that these images are in here, you can access them using this identifier here, and you can change that as you need. But whenever you want an image from here, or whenever you want to use an image in your app that is baked into the app rather than something you download off of the internet, you put it here into your assets bundle, and then it gets bundled into the app in a way that you can use later on. We also have these things: the launch screen.storyboard and the main.storyboard. All right, I'm going to show you storyboards. They're a lot. Okay, so just be ready. Storyboards are a wonderful way for building user interfaces that Apple has come up with. They show you a kind of preview of what you might expect your app to kind of look like as you're building. Storyboards are not typically used widely in industry because they don't scale up to large team sizes very well. If you're a solo developer making an app, or a small 2 to 4 person team size making a small application, storyboards are great. They're wonderful for prototyping things. They're awesome for all that stuff. But there are a lot of reasons why storyboards and Interface Builder just work very poorly when you're trying to deal with a massive application with 100 people editing the same code base, okay? One of the main reasons is that every time you touch and edit a storyboard, every time you touch it, it saves and its contents get rearranged, which means the git diff will be different whenever you make a commit, even if you haven't actually made any changes to the storyboard. You'll also run into constant conflicts with other people's changes to the storyboard. So it's something to use for yourself if you're building your own app. It is an excellent way to discover how things work in UIKit specifically. It doesn't exist for SwiftUI. It's not a thing at all. But when you're dealing with UIKit like we are doing today, it's a great kind of tool for building stuff. I will recommend for your assignment that you use the storyboards to explore and maybe plan out what you're doing. However, you will aim to build everything programmatically rather than through the storyboard. And the reason for this is just because it's what's considered best practice with UIKit in the industry right now. But I am showing you the storyboard so that you can know how to use it and find new stuff, because discoverability in the storyboard is way better than it is programmatically. So yeah, so this is our launch screen storyboard. This is the static screen that gets displayed while our application is loading. You can put a progress bar here. You can put a spinner here. You can put all sorts of stuff here. For now, we're going to put a dog here, right? So how do we do this? Here we've got this is our kind of view controller hierarchy, right? And you'll see here, this is the safe area as previously discussed, okay? So there's this little plus button up here. They used to have this somewhere else. I liked it more back then, but whatever, I'm old. So there's this plus button. This is a library of things that you can use, okay? This is why I say discoverability is way better here than it is in code, all right? You can look at these things here and all the different options that you have, right? And then you drag and drop them from here into here, right? And that's how you use them. So if we're going to show the dog, we want to have this image view. So we're going to drop it into here, right? We get these guides that help kind of show us, oh, cool, we're going to snap to the center, okay? It's not constrained to the center, but it's snapped to the center. And then we'll add our dog, like so. Our UI image view, as you can see here, is in the subviews list of the view that is the root view for the view controller, right? This is that kind of structure that we were talking about. Your view controller, its root view, and all of its subviews, right? This image view has a bunch of different options over here. There are all of these different buttons. Of them, you do not really need to care too much about this one. You do not really need to care about this one. You don't really need to care about this one, although this one gives basically documentation information, so if you care about that, it's helpful. This is kind of where you go if you're creating a custom view, but you don't need to worry about that too much. Attributes is kind of your big thing. This is where you can discover all of the things that you can do in this particular kind of view, okay? So here you can see there's this image view section, right, that we hid, and then there's this view section, right? So all this view stuff, anything that's a UI view is going to have these options. These are all the options that are available for all UI views, right? So you can get yourself familiar with these pretty quickly. There's not a lot, right? But here's that user interaction enabled that I mentioned, right? Here's that is hidden that I mentioned, right? And you'll note it kind of faded out, and so on. And then here, image view shows you all the different things that you can do for an image view specifically, right? You can have a different image that you use when it's highlighted. You can toggle between the highlighted and not highlighted state to see what it looks like. You can set these configurations and everything. But for the most part, images tend not to get configured too much beyond constraints. So we will quickly look at some constraints for this image view here. So constraints are handled by these buttons down here, okay? So constraints that are kind of external, but not exactly, but external, are these constraints here, okay? So these handle things like your leading edge distance, right? And your trailing edge distance, okay? Your top edge distance and your bottom edge distance. It does this spacing to nearest neighbor. This is the default. So if you have two images next to each other, it will automatically set the constraints to those two images. You can then modify that later on in one of the further tabs that we haven't looked at yet. But for now, we're going to go ahead and say that this image here, we don't need to worry too much about the width or the height. What we are going to constrain are its leading and trailing edge. We want those to be 0. Okay, so we're going to say, hey, please snap the left edge or the leading edge of our image to the leading edge of the nearest neighbor, or to the trailing edge of the nearest neighbor, or the leading edge of our super view if there is no nearest neighbor, which is what will happen, right? Same thing with the trailing edge. So if we do this and hit add constraints, then it does this, and it goes red and it yells at us, right? And it says, oh, there's a problem. You're missing constraints, right? And this is auto layout in a nutshell. You're going to get a lot of constraint issues when you deal with auto layout. It has a lot of requirements that are not always clear. But namely, this says it needs a constraint for the Y position. Basically, it knows that it should be snapped to the edge, but it doesn't know where it should put it in the Y position, right? Which should it be down here? Should it be up there? Where should it be, right? If you don't set it, it will still render. However, it will render incorrectly on different phone sizes. So if we switch this over to the iPhone 16 Pro Max, for example, you'll see that it's no longer in the center, okay? It's offset up and to the left a little bit, right? In order to make sure that it's always in the center, no matter what phone or iPad we use, right? And that's not in the center really at all, right? In order to do that, we need to set these constraints here, horizontally and vertically in the container. So this, if we set these both to 0, we'll snap it to the center. And there it is. It's been snapped to the center, and you notice it got bigger because now it was able to match its edge constraints and expand itself to the edge properly because it knew how to lay itself out. That's why it's called auto layout, because it automatically happens after a lot of manual intervention from you, but is what it is. Okay, so this is our launch screen. We've got this. Cool. Done. Awesome. All right. So now there's this main storyboard. Okay, so main.storyboard is sort of the main storyboard that you go into. There's this little arrow here. This is the storyboard entry point. So whenever this storyboard gets entered, which is something you can enter a storyboard or load a storyboard in code and then enter it. Every storyboard has one entry point. And there is also a, where is it? Is it in, oh, I'm doing something live. I shouldn't do that. but I'm pretty sure it's in here somewhere. There's a setting where you can change what your main storyboard is, right? I don't remember exactly where it is. I'll see if I can find it, and I will post it with my lecture corrections. But basically, you can change which file it is that gets loaded first after the launch is complete, right? Whatever. So you enter your storyboard, and then it goes to this view controller first, whatever this is, right? Now, this view controller in particular, because we've created a UIKit app using the template, it has created a special view controller here for us, right? That has this custom class set, right? And that is set to view controller, okay? Not UI view controller, right? We'll change that shortly. So here's our view controller, right? This is the view controller that's getting set and used for that particular view controller in the storyboard. So if we wanted to rename this to something else, for example, you can right-click it and go to Refactor Rename. This doesn't always work correctly, but they've gotten a lot better about this. It used to be it would only do it in code, and you'd have to change all the file names and all the storyboard references. Then they made it so that it worked on the file names, but not the storyboard references. And now it does it all, right? But the more complicated your code base gets, the worse it is at using this rename feature. So you might have to do it manually yourself. But you'll note that it's basically saying we'll rename the file, we'll rename this piece of commented out, text, we'll rename the class here, and we will rename the class name in the storyboard, right? So we're just going to call this, example view controller, right? Just to start with, okay? So here is that viewDidLoad method I mentioned. This is where you do all of your setup, right? This is where you want to make sure that everything is all set and ready to go. They have this thing where they call super.viewDidLoad. It's important if you are subclassing from another custom UI view controller class. However, Apple does not do anything in their own viewDidLoad. It's an empty method. So we can get rid of that. We don't need it because UI view controllers viewDidLoad doesn't do anything. So we don't need to call that. Or at least I don't think we do. We might need to later. I don't know. Okay. So here we are in viewDidLoad. Awesome. Cool. Now, the way that storyboards and UIKit kind of originally intended for us to add things and make modifications was to do it all in here, like we did with that image, right? So for example, if we wanted to say add a UI label, right? Then we would do this. We'd drag it in, we'd put it where we want it. We'd kind of, make it a little bigger, right? Place it here, snap it to the top, right? Go to the modification, change the settings. Let's make this font bigger, right? 36, something like that. We want to center align this. Okay. Let's see, anything else? Behavior, it's enabled. Yep, that's all good. Do we want a drop shadow? I feel like a drop shadow is a little much. So we're not going to do a drop shadow. That's fine. We'll just set it to default. There's a bunch of stuff you can do here, right? You can handle truncation, right? So if we wanted, to go like my label is way, there we go, 2, right? It was able to expand it here, right? But let's say we constrained it, okay? So let's, and we'll need to eventually if we want this to work correctly, right? So let's go ahead and set some constraints. So we're going to set these constraints. Rather than to 0, 0, let's go ahead and give them a nice amount of padding. So it's going to be 50 from either edge pushed in. The top, we want to constrain to 0. We want it to snap to that line that, the safe area top, right? And that means that it knows exactly where it's going to go. And because it's a UI label, it also knows its height because it knows its font size. So I don't think there will be any other constraints required. You'll note now we get this lovely ... right? That's because by default, UI labels are set to a single line, okay? And because they're set to a single line, it deals with truncation behavior. So here, this line break, you can have a truncate tail. You can tell it to truncate the middle instead. You can tell it to truncate the head. You can tell it to clip it, where it just cuts it off. You can tell it to do character wrap or word wrap. And that comes into play if you add more lines. So if you have more lines here and character wrap, then it does that. Character wrap's kind of gross. You can do word wrap instead, like so, right? And now it does that, okay? And you could still have truncate tail, and it's going to basically word wrap by default, right? You can also set the lines to 0. If you set the lines to 0, then it just says, we'll go as many lines as we need. You know, we don't care, right? Although typically you'll want to use a text view for that instead of a UI label. UI labels are supposed to be kind of shorter. So now, all these things that we're setting and modifying here, the alignment set to center, the font set to 36, or system 36, right? The lines set to 0. These are all properties that you can modify in code as well, right? So we'll take a look at that. Okay, so we've added this label here. Cool, great, right? But what if we want to change the text programmatically? What if we want to have a reference to this label, right? How do we get access to it? Well, you know, here in our example view controller, there's no property for it. There's no label, right? There's nothing, you know, for it, right? And if we look at this label, you know, it's a UI label. It doesn't have any custom identifier information. I guess we could try and search for its object ID. That seems pretty scuffed, right? The answer is that you can create something in your view controller called an IB outlet. An IB outlet is a special kind of attribute for properties that says, hey, this property is going to be used in Interface Builder. That's why it's IB outlet, Interface Builder outlet, okay? It's a way of connecting these things together. So we're going to call this header label, right? And this is going to be of type UI label, right? This is one of the rare instances where I'm okay with using the force unwrap. When your view first loads, when your view controller first loads, none of its subviews are instantiated yet. They don't exist in memory, okay? Which means that if you just set this like so, you'll get an error. IB outlet has non-optional type UI label. IB outlet requires that things be optional because the IB outlet might not be set. We've created this outlet, but we haven't set it yet, which means if we run this code, this variable is nil. There's nothing in it because we haven't set it anywhere, right? So it forces us to acknowledge that it could be nil. Now, if you use an exclamation mark, then if you ever try to use header label before you set it correctly, so if we tried to go header label.text equals my new text, right? If we ran this, it would crash as soon as we tried to access header label because it's nil and we force unwrapped it, right? This is why Swift's optionals force you to handle this sort of thing. However, if we did this, then we'd have to do optional chaining everywhere constantly, and it's ridiculous because the reality is if your IB outlet isn't set correctly and hasn't loaded correctly, you want to crash your app. You want to know that immediately, right? It's never going to happen to you in the wild. And if it does, that's because some bits got flipped in the user's phone due to a solar flare, okay? It's not something you should be trying to account for. So here's our header label. Here's our text. We've modified it to my new text. InView did load. Great. It'll crash if we run it. How do we fix that? We go back to the storyboard. We go to our example view controller. We double click like as in 2-finger click, or right click if you're using a mouse, on the view controller itself, and we get this stuff. These are all of the outlets and things that you can connect, okay? And you'll see all of a sudden up here, there's view, by the way, the view property. We can't modify this, it won't let us, right? But it's there for demonstration purposes, right? Here's our header label that we created, this outlet, it's right here. After you create it in your .swift file and save it, then when you next load the storyboard, it will appear, okay? So now what you can do is you can drag and drop it like this. And now this header label is tied together. These two things are tied to one another, right? And this IB outlet will work, and this will change this text to my new text. So instead of my label is way too long, it will say my new text when we run this in our iPhone 16 Pro, which I'm realizing is probably going to take up the entire screen, if not more. So we might need to make it smaller and pick a different sized iPhone. But give it some time. When it first launches, it's going to have to install it to your simulator. And here we're on our loading screen, and it's showing this and loading and doing loading things in the background right now as it's getting started. And here we are in our first view controller, and the text label, the UI label has been changed to my new text. Huzzah, right? And just, for the sake of, demonstration, if we didn't do that, then it would be, and you'll notice it's much faster once you've first installed it on the simulator, right? Then it is exactly what we put in here, right? Also of note, worth noting, this is what we're looking at in here is the iPhone 16, but this simulator is the iPhone 16 Pro. And you can change what simulator you're running up here. You can do it up here, and you can pick between all the different things that you have, all the different simulators you have available, right? So whatever you pick here, this is what it runs on. This is the simulator it opens for you, okay? So, cool. That's Interface Builder stuff. Basically, you get those properties and everything. Oh, one last thing. The constraints that we created, they are over here in this tab. This tab has our constraints. They're down here. This is what they look like. This is how you can do some crazy things in Interface Builder where you have things that constrain to each other. So like, for example, we're going to set this here, right? And then we'll set its constraint to the top, right? And we will right? And we will set its constraints to the sides as before, right? Notice when we duplicated this view, the constraints did not duplicate with it, by the way. And so, yeah. So now, let's say we've set this constraint so that they are, their distance between each other is default, whatever that is, right? I think it's 8 by default. But let's say we want it to be much further, right? We want it to be 50 or something like that. We can go in here, we can edit it, and we can make it 50, right? There's also this thing where there's this equal sign. You can do this less than or equal to. This is where you can get into some nonsense with variable. Why is it highlighting this one? That's so weird. Where you get variable constraints, where we say, oh, it must be 50 or less, right? And that allows things to expand and change in size and slide around and move and do all sorts of nonsense. We're not going to look too much at that because we're dealing with specifically things that deal with, because we're building things that specifically deal with the web. Most of the time, we're going to have primarily static views. You're not going to have to worry too much about crazy animation stuff, which is good news for you because animating things is truly terrible. So, yeah.
Professor, have error. Views without any layout constraints may flip their content or overlap other views.
Views without layout constraints may clip their content over other views, right? And so that's an error that's telling you that you haven't set enough constraints yet. Basically, auto layout has a bunch of ways that it tries to figure out where to draw your content. And if you provide sufficient information for it to know how big the view should be and where it should be, so size and position are the two things it needs to know, right? Then you won't get an error, right? The trick is understanding what can tell it that information, right? In this case, for these labels, we only need the top, the leading, and the trailing edge constraints, right? For some things, you might need to set a width constraint or a height constraint, right? It depends on the situation. So that's something you'll kind of learn sort of over time. But basically, try and set some constraints on that view, and it will yell at you with a new error about what constraints are missing, right? Presumably. Yeah. Cool. Okay. So this is Interface Builder. It's a great tool for learning how the constraints work, because as you noted, it gives you errors when there are problems with the constraints. And it's a great way to look at the properties of different views and discover what different views there are that you can use and how they work together, okay? So it's an excellent learning tool. It is the preferred way to build interfaces when you are first starting out with UIKit, but it is not a way that works once you get into high levels of industry doing iOS development. So use it for learning, and then practice actually writing it in code, which is what we will do in the next workshop segment, which I believe we will be doing after 5 minutes. So yeah, 5 minutes, and then if you have any questions, you can ask me in between. So we'll look at writing some code next.